I'm going to sit through most of this because I will be typing furiously. This will be done live. So please point and giggle if I screw something up. We'll start off with, come on, computer. A little bit about what we're going to go over. I'm going to introduce you to the topic myself a little bit more. We're going to go over how Puppet can manage files, whole files, as well as the next section then will be managing just lines inside of a file. And then I can show you some various patterns that can be used if you're writing your own modules to allow other modules to interact with your module writing out these files. We'll have some time for questions at the end, and then links to all of this documentation and the presentation itself will be at the very end, so don't need to type furiously for links and things like that. This is all online, including the live demo and tutorial and all that stuff. So at the very end will be a link to that. So the intro. Who am I? Kara has pretty much destroyed this slide for me and presented who I am. I am a Puppet certified professional. Took the test a couple years ago that Puppet Labs put out and apparently passed, so I get that title. Been doing IT for a little while. Right now I'm doing Hadoop infrastructure engineering. So I run a smaller sized clusters for Apollo Education Group, otherwise known as University of Phoenix here in town. And I do a lot of stuff with Puppet, both personal time and at work. So what I'm going to go into is that, well, of course, Puppet can manage files. This may be obvious for some of you that have used Puppet before, but you can do both entire files. You just write out an entire config file that you want onto the file system. You can do just the lines inside that file. You can use static content, so just pick up this file, drop it in place. Or you can use templates to write out that file, put variables in there, dynamically create content, etc. And excitement about live demos is you lose everything sometimes. All right. First, what an excitement. I have a cursor, that is always good. Let's reload it. Why not? So some of this code that I'm going to show you is actual snippets of Puppet language, and assuming my VM just didn't die on me, which would be the most fun thing that could happen. There we go. I'll be showing you the actual file resource and then going into some various ways to modify that file resource and then showing you some of the other resources that are available in the Puppet realm to go over that. All right, so back to where we start. We're managing files. This is a basic file resource. You guys see that in the back. It's just a horrible color. All right. So we have a file resource, and it's going to define a file that we're going to write out to temp. We have some parameters that we give to that file. We're going to ensure that it's present. We can set a mode on it, set an owner in a group. These are all basic stuff we can do. I'm going to keep most of these out of the rest of the presentation. But we'll go over the next resource here. So we're going to use the source attribute to the file resource. I'm going to have to turn it look right now and see what I'm doing. So we're going to write out a temp test file A. We're going to ensure it's present, give it a mode, and we're going to take this file we have built into our module, our example module, and we're just going to drop it in place, because that's going to be the easiest thing for us to do. So I'm going to cut and paste. This might be the best way to do it. Come on again. And we're going to do a puppet apply run on that actual file. Hopefully everything's running right. Or slowly, one of the two. There's our puppet run. And we're going to cat that file, and there's some content that we have. And it looks pretty much exactly like the content that we have built into our module. So that is the source resource there that we can use to just move a file in place. You can do multiple source attributes. And this is kind of a tricky way to say, if the first one isn't, if we can find the first attribute here, go ahead and put that file in place. And it's using a variable called : operating system that each machine will set that variable to the OS that's running on it. It could be CentOS, could be AIX, could be Windows. And if that file exists inside your module, it'll use that. Otherwise, it'll use the, it'll fall back to the default here of file B. And so we're going to see that in use here.
Sorry, but can you make the text in bigger?
Unfortunately, that's it for the
Okay,
text.
that's what's going to stick. Cool.
Yeah, we're kind of stuck on that. So the output here is basically saying this file is on operating system CentOS. And that is a variable that we grabbed out of the file B. Here's the example. So file B itself is, file B is very plain. The next one, there's a file B.AIX, so it tells us file B is on operating system AIX. And the last one is file B CentOS, and that's where we're actually getting the content from. The next option that we could use with the file resource is the content parameter. And this basically allows you to put the actual content there in your Puppet manifest. And it's basically going to put it in there raw, just exactly as you see. We're going to paste this in place and let Puppet do its run. And once that's done, we're going to look at that content. So we get some fancy string, just like the code here. And you'll notice that there's no carriage return at the very end. So you got to be really careful about whether or not, if you want a line feed at the end of that. Basically, you just put a slash n here at the end of your some fancy string, and you'll get a line feed. We'll see that here in a moment because the next example will show that exact thing. Get your line feed right here. So this is a way of also doing variable substitution with that content parameter. We're going to grab some variables called : operating system release, as well as : architecture, and we're going to have some dynamic output there in the file that gets written out. And you'll see we have two lines. Your operating system release, or your operating system is CentOS 7, and your CPU architecture is x86-64. Even though I've got these kind of wrapped a little bit for the example here, everything is done correctly with the carriage return here and the one here. So this lets you put content there exactly in your manifest. We also have the ability to use templates, which instead of putting all of your content there inside your manifest, you can put it in an external file. And that file will let you basically put a few more lines. You can be a lot more verbose and whatnot. We're going to use this example here and do two variable substitutions inside that template. So first off, we're going to set some variables. We're going to set variable A to good and variable B to horrible. And they're going to get substituted here inside this template in the various spots. And we'll see that happen just as soon as I get the apply run going. Now, these template files that we're using, they're called ERBs. They're Ruby templating, and they basically allow you to do raw Ruby inside that file. And that gets interpreted when the template function gets called and output to the screen there, or to the file that we're dealing with. And here we go with the actual output that you see here from the template. We get those variables substituted in there. Let's see. You can also do, similar to the source, you can do multiple content, multiple templates inside of your content parameter. The thing that's different between content and source when you're doing this is that the templates will concatenate themselves instead of just picking one or another that's available. So we're actually going to see both the template A from the previous example along with template B, which has this output here, concatenated into the same file. So we've got this is a good day, there will be a horrible calamity, and we are using Red Hat OS family. And inside Ruby, the way to pull up variables, fact-based variables, is to use a scope to pull up the OS family fact. In addition to the template function, we have inline templates, which allow you to do Ruby directly inside your Puppet manifest. This is similar to just using straight content in there. You want to try and keep it simple. But if you don't want to use an external template file, you can do it this way, and you get the same results. The variables will be substituted. We've got options, which is an array of 3 values, and item, and we will end up with those options joined together. This is a Rubyism there. And the output then is item, so the sky is blue, heavy, and yummy. What else can we do here? Let's see. There is yet another function that can be used inside content. Content's like the big anything you want in here, and you can start using functions that are built into Puppet itself. File is another example of the type of function that can be used. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to grab the etc host file off of the Puppet master and put it in place on the agent. We're just going to pick it up and copy it over. Let's see, we are looking at this H. And we'll take a look at the file here. We basically copied the etc host file in place and into our example. The almost last of the section, we've got a new type of function called EPP. This is something coming out in Puppet 4, where you can do, instead of Ruby as the embedded language inside your template, you can actually do Puppet language inside your template. Now with Puppet 4, there's a lot of new things coming out in the language, one of which is iteration. You can actually do something similar to for loops inside Puppet. I'm not really up to speed on all the cool new stuff, but the bottom line is that your template will look a little bit different in that variables will be with a $sign instead of the Ruby @ sign. So if you're just doing straight variable substitution, you can do it, just change out that variable. You do need to make sure to set the parser equals future option. Otherwise, so that you can get the future parser to use the EPP template. And we get pretty much the exact values that we're expecting with the variable substitution. Let's see. Now with all these examples, maybe you guys are wondering, what's the difference between source and content parameters inside the file resource? Well, with the content, with the source attribute, you can recursively copy directories of files over onto your Puppet agent. With content, you're stuck just dealing with one particular file. But if you set up the source parameter just right, you can basically pick up an entire directory off your Puppet master and ship it over to your agent with one setting. And you just need to set two more attributes, recurse attribute and the, where is it? Well, just the recurse attribute, and set that to true, and it will copy everything that's in that file directory that you indicate in the manifest. So one of the last full file manipulation resources that are out there is the Concat Resource. And this is a separate module that you can find on the Module Forge. And it basically will take some fragments that you can define, not just in your direct manifest, but you can also have fragments set up in different manifests and different modules. And this way you can put together a whole bunch of different pieces to create one big file. Now what this is going to do is we're going to use the Concat resource, and very similar to the file resource, we're going to define a file that we're going to write out. We're going to set it in sure, present, and in mode. You can also set it a group and owner, those sorts of parameters. And then we're going to give it a fragment. So the first fragment that we're going to define, we're going to give it a unique name, call it test file J -01. We're going to give it the target parameter to tie it back into the primary Concat resource. Then we're going to set some content on there, very similar to the file resource content. We're just going to write out this particular line with a carriage return in it. And we're going to set the order. So this will be the first fragment that gets put together into this file. The next fragment, we're going to give it another unique name, set the target to our test file J, and we're going to use a source attribute, very similar to the file resources source parameter. And we're going to pull file A out of our example module and put it in place as the second fragment. So let's see what this is going to look like once we do our Puppet run. We should end up with 4 lines in our file. As soon as this runs. There's a bit of output while the concat function files get pulled over. Make sure this is scrolled to the bottom. And it's way off the screen. All right, so we are Puppet run finished, and we're going to cat our test file, and we have our first line here from the first segment. There. And then we have the last 3 lines from our second file A segment. And this is not very easy to do. I'm trying to highlight. So this way you can put these concat fragments in different modules if you need to, and have various pieces of your infrastructure then fitting together this file that you're needing to write out, this config file.
Why did it put the name of the file?
How do you mean?
File
So file A right here.
A. Is that actually in the file?
Yes, so this is from our very first example at the beginning. File A is actually in that file name. Let me set that. Modules. Example. A. So that's the actual content of that file. That's how I got the file name in there. So that is our section on managing entire files. Our next section is going to be about just managing lines inside of a file. I'm not going too fast. That's one question I should be asking. All right, keeping up with everybody? Yes, sir.
I see what, I see what you're doing, but how do you get those, if you just have variables in the file, it's kind of a limited thing. So how do you get the, say from a higher part of the hierarchy, decide which variables are, what those variables are going to be? Like, say you have variable A. If I just have, in the module itself, I just put variable A is equal, and then I go and then put, reference it, variable A, then that's not very useful to me. But if I can set that variable A, depending on some circumstances, or depending on what module it is in, or something like that, then.
So correct, when you set your variable, and this is just for the examples that I was showing you how I set the, dollar variable A equals some value. You can set those variables usually as parameters to your module. When you call the class that your module is in, you'll set up parameters that can be fed into it. And that way you can input your variables in that manner, instead of just hard coding them like in the examples that I'm showing. All right, so managing lines. We're going to be managing just lines inside of files. And one method that is built into Puppet itself is the Egeus type, or the Egeus resource. And if you've ever used the Egeus augtool command, it comes with a lot of Linux systems, Solaris, pretty much a lot of Unixes. Egeus knows how to write out lines inside of various different config file types. Your etcresolve.conf, your etc host, it understands each of the positions in that file and how to address them programmatically. So Egeus will let you take an understanding of, let's say, for this example, the resolve.conf file, and programmatically allow us to just set domain example.net. So let me start from the top on this one. We have a file resource here that we're defining. We're basically going to copy the etcresolve.conf file to our temporary file. Now this is just a setup for the demo. After that, we're going to run Egeus, and we're going to have it talk to our temp file here. So it's going to be in our temp file. We're going to use a particular lens on this, resolve.lens. And these two lines that we have here in the demo, these are just for the demo. If we were actually operating on etcresolve.conf, we would just need to put this last line here for changes. We're going to change the domain line that's in the resolve.conf to say example.net instead of whatever it is that we're copying in place. So let's go ahead and run this and see what Puppet will give us. All right, so we've created the file and allowed Egeus to operate on it. Our temp file here is basically saying domain example.net. Now, the actual resolve.conf file, just so it doesn't look like I'm doing anything strange, the domain is razorsedge.org in the original file. With Egeus, you kind of have to know the underlying language, but it gives you basically a one-line sort of parameter that you can set various things to inside files that Egeus understands. The next resource, which is much more generic, is file line. And this is found in the Puppet Labs standard lib module, which pretty much everyone nowadays is probably going to have that installed. A lot of modules tend to rely on various functions and things that are inside there. So if you have standard lib installed, you have file line available to you. And file line basically just lets you put an exact line. Everything you put inside the line parameter here, where's my cursor? Everything between these two quotes goes exactly into that file at some point. No guarantee where, but it'll end up in that file. So this is similar to our Egeus example. We're going to make sure that there's a test file in place. And then we're going to use file line. We're going to ensure that it is present. We're going to give it a path to the test file. And we're going to see about the line that needs to be in that file for us. And we're going to give Puppet a chance to run here. And inside that file, which was empty when we created it, is now this line should be present. You can have multiple file lines defined. We could have a second file line with a unique name and put another value in here, and it would also show up in this file. With file line, you can also do replacement. So if you set the match parameter, it will actually go out and replace the file. So we're going to copy in resolve.com. We're going to make sure the line search local domain exists, but we're going to match any regular expression that says if the word search starts at the beginning of the line, let's replace that. Otherwise, file line will just add another search line in there and leave the current one alone. So we're going to see that example.
Will it match the first or all?
It's a regular expression, so just as if you were putting grep through there, if there are multiple search lines, it would replace all of them.
Right, but you said file line ensures that it will be there once.
Correct.
So it will just match and just keep adding it.
It's smart enough to know that if it matches the line that you're trying to add, it will make sure that just one instance of that line will be in there.
You don't know which.
Well,
It'll be the first.
so the match will make sure any search lines, we're going to take those out, rips them out of the file. Then it puts in the line that you want into that file. The next time it runs, it'll see that match and say, oh, well, effectively it'll rip it up, put it in place, but there's no change, so you end up with the exact same value each time Puppet runs again. But yeah, if there are multiple lines that match your pattern, it will remove all of them and then just put the one in place that you're looking at. And here we are. We have search local domain, which it was searchrazorsedge.org, if you remember from previous examples. Yes, sir.
So did you say that it will run every time, and therefore your file, the timestamp on your file will always be within the last 30 minutes of the Puppet runs?
I am not sure. I haven't checked the idempotency. I would imagine that it's smart enough not to continuously update the file, with the same content, but I haven't actually looked to see if the timestamp's going to change. The next way that you can modify lines inside of a file is by using ini file. So if your config file follows the ini settings, where it has a header in brackets and then key equal value pairs after inside those sections, ini file is a module that understands that and will do some pretty cool things for you. In this example, we're going to use ini_setting, and that's the name of the resource. We're going to give it a unique name, and I'm just using this. You can put whatever unique name in there you want. We're going to ensure it's present, give it a path to the file. Then we've got sections, setting, and values. So we're going to create a foo section if it doesn't already exist. And then we're going to set bar equals gibberish inside that file. And let's see. Go ahead and give Puppet a chance to run and modify that file. And here we go. From an empty file, we have our foo section added, and we have our key value pair, bar equal gibberish, added there at the bottom. Now, in a existing ini file, we're going to copy in one that we've got. Looks like There's an INI file from some Perl module. We're going to copy that in place and then modify that just to see what sort of things we'll do for an existing file. Basically, we're looking for a section called build, and we're going to set test n equals to we did it. Again, if there is no section called build, it will add it, and then add the key value pair there to it. So our test file had a bunch of pre-existing XML, or pre-existing sections and key value pairs, and then here at the bottom, we add our build section and our test n equals we did it. All right, coming up on the end of the file line modifying section, we have another module out there on the Puppet Forge called DataCat. And this one can be a little complicated, especially in the example that I pulled directly off of the DataCat README. But it's kind of similar to the Concat resource, except that you can modify parts of the line from various fragments. Basically, as the guy that wrote it states, you stitch together line fragments in the same line or in multiple lines. So, kind of similar to file or concat, we have a DataCat resource. We define our test file P, we ensure present, give it a mode, and you can define a template that it's going to use. Now this template, and I'll show you the template here in a moment, it's going to have your Ruby code that's in there, your variable substitutions and whatnot. But it'll allow these DataCat fragments then to operate on it. The first fragment that we are going to define here, we're just going to give it this unique name of FQDN in device host group. The target we're going to define to point back to our DataCat source. The data that we're going to put in there is going to be this hash and hashed array, or I never get this right when I'm trying to describe this. Basically, the data parameter has got the my host group pointing at the FQDN value inside of the array. And this will be order of 1, so this will be our first fragment. Our next fragment, we're going to take this variable that we set, we're going to basically modify the fully qualified domain name of the node. We're going to add a -ilo to the end of the hostname section, the first section before the first period. So it'll be hostname -ilo. We're going to take that new variable we defined, point at the same target, have a very similar data section using the ILO FQDN variable, and we're going to set that in the second position of the concatenation. And let's see, let's take a look at that template first, because this can be a little bit difficult sometimes to visualize. And this is way here down here at the bottom. Let me I'll move it up a little bit. We've got some Ruby in here, doing some magic, and I'm not much of a Rubyist, so I might slaughter the description here. We're going to take the keys in the data variable, I guess, which is right up in here. We're going to take the keys, so my host group is going to be the keys. We're going to sort them, and then for each of those keys, we're going to map it into this variable inside the template called host group. So each time we have host group here inside of the variable substitution, we're going to use that value. So when Puppet runs, it's going to output define host group, open bracket, name, and the host group is going to be my host group. And then we're going to have members, and this is where the interesting part of multiple fragments on the same line come into play. So in that data variable, in the host group array, we're going to join those values, which are ILO FQDN and FQDN, and we're going to comma separate those and write them out into the line. And that's going to end the template there. So let's get Puppet to run, and we'll see the actual output. All right, that was the run, and here is the output here to the screen. The My Host group gets pulled in from the fragment, and the members get added. So we have localhost.razorsedge.org, which is what FQDN is on this particular machine, and then our FQDN or ILO_FQDN variable is here, the localhost-ILO. So with all this complexity, I can probably come up with a much simpler example, but if you're using Nagios and you want Puppet to stitch things together, this is the perfect example to see how to get multiple values on one line. So some of the things, one thing to be aware of is that the file and Concat resource, they can make backups of the files. So if you want to keep track of modifications that are being made, and you have your Puppet file server set up in the backup source, you can have those files backed up to your Puppet master in case you need to restore them or keep track of things for auditing purposes. If you're using some of the line-based methods with FileLine and iFile, you don't actually get the backups. They will just go out and modify your file and make sure those modifications stay in place. So if you're looking for the ability to recover to what the previous version might have been, you might make sure that you understand that there won't be a previous version if you're using some of those line-based methods. So lastly, in our demo section, I'm going to show you some various patterns that you can use, or that have been used by modules, to allow other modules in code to interact with your module trying to write out a single configuration file or multiple files or whatnot. And these are patterns that they come in handy to allow ways to stitch these file pieces together. Let's go. The first example here is going to be sudo. I'm sure everyone that's run Unix before is familiar with sudo. You got this one big monolithic file that you need to put a whole bunch of stuff into, and you might have several modules that need various settings in there. Luckily, in this day and age, the sudo configuration allows you to dump snippets inside of a directory, which this particular module will help with. But back in the day, it was very, very difficult trying to get multiple sudo configs into that one big file. This is a way, using the sudo module, and this is actually the sas/sudo module on the Puppet Forge. This is a way to define snippets using the sudo ::conf define. Saz, S-A-Z, and there'll be a link at the very end to his module. I just forgot to put the attribution of this exact piece here in the slide, so I wanted to make sure that that was done. We're going to define class sudo here at the top, and this is something you don't need to do necessarily, but I don't want it to wipe out my sudo permissions here. So we're going to keep all the existing configuration, and we're not going to replace any config file. Otherwise, I end up not getting root back onto this VM. And then we're going to have our first snippet, sudo conf. We're going to call it web, and very similar to the file resource, we're going to use source, and it's going to grab a file out of our module and drop it in place in the right location. Our next sudo conf, we're going to name it admins. We're going to give it a priority, which is important for ordering the various snippets inside sudors. And we're going to use the content parameter and write out %admins all equals all. Basically, the sudor bit to allow everybody in the admin group to, without a password, become root. And lastly, we're going to do similar, a config called Joe, give it a priority 60, and have that written out. So we're going to go ahead and run this. Now this is the part of the demo where I've got to do stuff as root because you can't have a non-root user modifying the sudoers configuration. But no worries, Puppet will do all the right things eventually. When this runs, one of the neat things about this sudo module is that it will make sure that the config snippets that you're giving it are correct. Otherwise, you'll end up with a broken sudoers and no one will be able to use it. So you'll see here when sudo runs that it's running the exact sudo syntax check. So it's checking each of these bits that you're putting in there. And if you do something wrong in here, it'll abort without modifying things such that you can't get back to root. So that's run. Let's take a look in our sudoers.d directory, and we have a few snippets that we added in there. We have 10 admins. We have an existing 10 vagrant that was already on our system, which since we're not wiping the existing configs, that remains there. We have 10 web and 60 Joe. And if you take a look at the which one? The 10 admins, sudoers.d, 10 admins. We will see, oh, come on, I should cat that file, shouldn't I? It is a directory. Cut and paste. Oh, and we come to the first bad thing about my keyboard is that my one key is really sticky. All right, and we have in the 10 admins, we have the exact lines that we put up here in our content. And I'd cat the others, but they are basically going to have similar content that we have buried inside of our module here. So that's the sudoers configuration. Let's see, next one. There's another module out on the Forge called Egeus Providers. And this is different than the built-in Egeus resource in that the Egeus resource is like the underlying, you have all of the power and all of the complexity trying to write that to modify the correct file and check to make sure that you're not re-adding a line or whatnot to that file. With Egeus Providers, you have an abstraction that some of these guys wrote that allows you to basically say, I want the sshd config resource. I want to set permit root login, make sure the value is present, and set it to no. So very simply, we're going to take a look at that value right now. It is set to yes. We're going to run the Egeus Providers example, and we're going to see that change. And it is now set to no. Now this is just modifying the config file. If you actually want to restart your SSH daemon, you've got to add a little trigger and a little bit more code to do that sort of magic for you. But this way you don't have to figure out the Egeus resource built in the Puppet and all of the magic required to get it to understand, check for this line, make sure it's there, and don't duplicate it. This will do it for you in a flash. Similarly, Egeus Providers has a kernel parameter. So when you're booting your system, if you want to add a kernel command line to your grub configuration or Lilo or whatever you're using to boot, this will allow you to set, for example, elevator equals deadline inside that config file. So we're taking a look at our grub2 config, and at the very end here and here, we don't see any elevator line in here. So we're going to go ahead and run this example and have Puppet cleanly apply that to the grub configuration file. might be unhappy with it. There we go. That took a little while to run, but we have elevator equals deadline now in that configuration on all the lines that are inside that config file. And of course, if you want these parameters to be valid, you've got to reboot your system. Let's see, next one. There's yet another Egeus provider, and I just picked like 4 of them to demo. There are several dozen that the guys have written to allow you to use Egeus in a very simple, sane, easy manner. This one here is called ShellBar, and it is basically going to write out a key value pair inside one of the sysconfig files, particularly the network file. And it's going to set host name equal to host equals example.com. So in the example we've got here, the file is effectively empty. It's just got a comment. We're going to run the ShellBar example. And it has set host name equals host.example.com, just like we wanted. And last example for Egeus Providers is setting kernel parameters. And these are not the ones you boot with, but the ones that are running on the system. It's called sysctl. And we're going to set our IP forwarding, so net.ipv4.ip_forward. We're going to make sure it's there. We're going to set it to a value of 1. And just to make things cool, we're going to add a comment to the file so that we know Puppet did this and why and where we can look it up. Now, this one actually will deal with, this is the current running value. It's equal to 0 on the running kernel. And the config file itself doesn't have a whole lot in it, just a bunch of comments. We're going to run this code example. We're going to see the change, and hopefully it'll actually change our running kernel value as well. The parameter is now set to 1. And inside our syscontrol file, we have not only a comment, but the actual value. So next time we reboot, this will be live on that system. All right, I think we are down to our last example. And this is the big doozy one. But this one is going to basically allow us to set up an Apache vhost on a machine. And all you really need are those 4 lines to set up a new vhost. We're going to call it first.example.com, make sure it's running on port 80, and set a document root for it. Now, one thing to note is that we don't even have the HTTPD server installed. And hopefully this doesn't take too terribly long. But this example is going to not only install Apache and configure it and turn it on, but it's going to set up that virtual host, create the directory that's needed, and activate that configuration for us. This is the part where I get up and dance a little bit because it could take it quite a bit while it tries to go out and yum install this particular thing. I cached it locally, but of course the metadata is probably stale at this point. But you'll see some lines come flying by here in a moment. This Apache module does a whole slew of things, which I'm not even going to try and explain. All right, dancing.
Is this the Puppet Lab Apache?
Yes, this is Puppet Labs Apache that I'm using. You can get that off the module forge. There's a lot of documentation to it. But luckily, just this snippet of code will do all the magic behind the scenes for you. Yeah, that yum config's going to take a while. All right, so bottom line is, I've got a little note here on the slide itself. get my pointer to it. There's a config file that will be named etc/httpd conf.d25 star. If you cat that file, you'll see the actual virtual host snippet that's written out. I don't want to sit here all day while this thing decides to pull down a few meg of data off the internet. So we'll go to our next slide, which is questions. Yes, ma'am.
So, if it was already cached and the yum installed and needed to happen, how quickly, or do you know how quickly it could pull it down?
If the main,
Can you repeat the question?
the question is, how fast would this install happen if, since I had the RPMs cached and the metadata were updated? It takes about 30 seconds to do the install if you have a fast connection and ability to get to your Yum repository.
Okay, thanks.
Does it always look local first?
Yes. So I ran a Yum dash download only beforehand.
What was the question? Does it always look locally first?
Does the Yum command always look locally first when installing packages? So yeah, if you have RPMs cached in its package directory, it'll do that quickly. Yes, sir.
In all of your demos, you ensured that the file was there. In real life, we would probably say the file's not there created. Is there a pattern for that?
You could use exactly the code that I wrote to do that sort of thing. You can define the file resource, and you might have noticed a little arrow at the very end of the closing curly bracket that then make sure that you have that file resource defined before the next resource. You can do that, just have it not define a source or content to make sure that file is there before any further things. There's a lot of different patterns that you can do, and probably spend a few more minutes going over those sorts of things. But yes, sir.
Will dynamically create directories for files that we create.
So will Puppet dynamically create directories for files that you're putting in place? Short answer is no. You need to make sure that if your directory doesn't already exist in your running file system where Puppet's installed, that you also have file resources that create those directories before the file. You don't have to set an order on those resources. Puppet will automatically realize that, oh, I need to put this directory into place before the file. Luckily, temp should be available on all of our systems, otherwise interesting things might happen.
Does the line replace where it has the match, does it also support back references in the line that you're putting in?
I am not certain. Okay, so question was, does the file line resource support back references to match parameter? Not terribly certain. There's some links to the documentation, and it's pretty straightforward to read through that and whatnot. Any further questions? So there are some links. I'm just going to flash these up here. Links to basically all the documentation, all the modules that are built into this presentation. And these are the other modules here at the last section. And the most important page. I even have a QR code for you. This is how you figure out where this presentation is, and contact me at some point if you have any further questions. Hope you found this enjoyable and understanding. Yes, sir. One more
I
question.
had one follow-up question. So if I wanted to use regex or XSLT directly on the file, would I have to go through another tool, or is there a way with the Puppet system to actually get into that level of detail?
So if you wanted to use regex or XSLT on files, is there a way in Puppet to do that directly? I am not certain. Inside the Puppet language, you only have a few bits that you can toggle. I'm not sure about XSLT, the style sheets, I believe, for XML, whether or not there's a tool to directly modify those. There might be. The Puppet board has a lot of stuff that even I haven't figured out what all is there. So
You know, just cheat and create a script that will go to the file that you want and have Puppet call and execute those scripts.
As the comment states, you can always cheat and create an exec resource that runs your script to get down there and do whatever you want.
And everybody does that.
Yeah, a lot of people do that.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.